Most philosophers wrote books or essays. Some philosophers like Plato famously wrote in dialogues, and others like Parmenides wrote in poems. The philosopher we'll be looking at today wrote in one-liners, and his name is Heraclitus of Ephesus, and he was also known as the Riddler, not to be confused with the Batman villain who came some 2,500 years later. Now, Heraclitus didn't just write a sentence onto a clay tablet and gave it to someone in the marketplace. He did apparently write a book called On Nature. You might think that with such a title, Heraclitus must have been a natural scientist, but the way ancient Greek thinkers used the word nature was with a much broader meaning in mind. The Greek word for nature is physis, and it's actually where we get the word physics from, and physis for the Greeks was just about everything there was, and that was the topic of Heraclitus' book. He reportedly wrote on the cosmos, on political questions and the gods. And just like with most other ancient Greek thinkers, we've only got fragments on these topics. Here is where it gets interesting though, as the fragments we have got from Heraclitus don't look like excerpts from a book. Instead, they look like one-liners or philosophical riddles. Let me show you some examples. A road, uphill, downhill, one and the same. Or, donkeys would choose garbage rather than gold. Or his most famous quote, "You can't step into the same river twice," which, as we'll see later, is actually a bit of a mistranslation. Heraclitus also liked wordplay, one example being the bow. Its name is life, its work is death. It's a pun, and trust me, it sounds better in Greek, in which the words for bow and life are both spelled bios. Now, these one-liners are pretty good, but what do they have to do with philosophy? Let's take a look at other things Heraclitus had to say, and we'll understand soon enough. We will begin by taking a look at Heraclitus' idea of knowledge, about which he had the following to say. "All of which the learning is, seeing and hearing, that I value most." This seems to align Heraclitus to a form of empiricism, the idea that knowledge primarily comes from sensory experiences, in this case seeing and hearing. At another point, though, he says the following: "Bad witnesses are eyes and ears to people when they have souls that do not speak the right language." These senses, it appears, require an adequate soul in order to understand the world. We could also say that what we experience with our senses is already shaped by our preconceptions. This way, Heraclitus can handily explain how people can fail to see what is before their eyes, or how he puts it, "The fools hear but are as though deaf. As the saying has it, they are absent though present." So we can't just take our senses at their word, but they require an adequate effort in order to be deciphered or interpreted. In a way, it seems then that the world is full of riddles and that nature likes to conceal itself. Heraclitus now wants to solve these riddles and to reveal the world as it is. For this task, he says, latent structure is master of visible structure. Solving the riddles then is discovering the latent structure of the nature of things. And in order for others to solve those riddles, he points not to himself as the answer, but rather he says, "When one listens, not to me, but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one." So we shouldn't listen to Heraclitus, but instead the Logos, which is a Greek word which commonly meant word, but had a multitude of different uses. We can assume that Logos in this case meant something like reason or rationality. Heraclitus then is claiming that his way of seeing things is the only rational way, and he is committed to recognizing a concealed system which can be accessed by finding the clue, which is the latent structure, which seems to be the structural pattern which we will call a unity in opposites. The unity in opposites can be found in Heraclitus in three ways. We've already seen it earlier expressed in examples taken from everyday experiences. He also generalizes from these examples and applies the pattern in the construction of theories. Let us take a look at some everyday examples Heraclitus presents us. Beginning is together with end on a circle. Physicians cut and burn people and ask for a fee on top of that. And the probably correct version of the famous river quote. Into rivers, the same ones. On those who step in, different and different waters flow. Looking at these examples, it seems that opposites, as a way to structure and think about our experiences, are not necessarily opposed and distinct, but rather they are found in ordinary life to be co-present, interdependent, changing into one another and in a unity. The doctor heals you by hurting you, a river stays the same by consisting of constantly changing water. Now, you might either think that the oppositions we are looking at are either unreal or merely relative, but the point which Heraclitus is trying to make is not just that the road being uphill or downhill depends on the relative direction of travel, but that the road uphill really is the same as the road downhill. We can see this point in another fragment. Sea, purest and most polluted water, for fish drinkable and life-sustaining, for people undrinkable and death-bringing. The effects of seawater are relative to who's drinking it, but Heraclitus explicitly says that the sea is simultaneously both purest and most polluted. With that out of the way, let's look at what generalized theses we can construct from the everyday patterns we've laid out. Edward Hussey in the Cambridge Companion to Early Greek Philosophy suggests the following. The unity is more fundamental than the opposites. The opposites are essential features of the unity, and the manifestation of the opposites involves a process in which the unity performs its essential function. This third thesis is supported by the following fragment. They do not understand how the diverging agrees with itself. A structure turning back on itself, such as that of the bow or of the lyre. Diverging and turning back implies some kind of movement or process, while harmony suggests a built-in teleology or function. There are some objections to Heraclitus' thinking, most notably the objection by Aristotle that Heraclitus inevitably ends up in violating the principle of non-contradiction, which means that Heraclitus' theory collapses. This problem can be solved by borrowing a tool from Aristotle himself. If we say that seawater is both life-sustaining and death-bringing, we can understand these two things as potentialities. Seawater has the potential to be life-sustaining, and the potential to be death-bringing. We can also apply this to other everyday examples to understand them better. The road is potentially both the road uphill and downhill, but neither the uphillness nor the downhillness is actual until someone actually travels them. Having dealt with this objection and clarified how we are to understand the unity and opposites, let's move on to Heraclitus using this core idea to shape his other theories. First, let us take a look at his cosmology. If you've watched my previous video, then you'll know that early Greek philosophers loved having a fundamental principle, and Heraclitus was no different. While Thales had water and Anaximenes air, Heraclitus wanted to explain the universe through fire, as he says in two fragments. No god and no human being made this cosmos, but it was always and is and will be an everlasting fire, getting kindled in measures and getting quenched in measures. All things are in exchange for fire, and fire for all things, as gold is for goods and goods for gold. In the first fragment we can see his previous principles being applied. The ever-living fire consists of a unity and opposites, the unity in this case being the fire, and the opposites being the kindling and quenching. Thinking back at the theses we discussed earlier, we can see that the fire as a unity is more fundamental than the opposites, as a fire could not be kindled or quenched if it did not exist. The opposites are essential features of the unity, because the kindling and quenching allows the fire to change, and therefore explains change on a cosmic level. And the manifestations of the opposites involves a process in which a unity performs its essential function. This can be seen as kindling and quenching imply processes which revolve around the fire, the unity, which is performing its essential function of creating the universe. The second fragment seems to clarify how exactly fire interacts with the universe. It seems that similarly to Anaximenes, who had air transformed into all things, Heraclitus has fire be transformed into every possible thing. Further, this fragment seems to suggest that Heraclitus also thought that certain proportions of fire made certain things, or that the universe was mixed up of fixed proportions, as he uses the analogy of exchanging gold for goods. With that being said, let's move on to Heraclitus' theory of the soul. For Homer, the soul was not important during life, but for Heraclitus it was clear that the soul was the carrier of personal identity and character, as well as of intelligence. A person is their soul, and the theory of soul is the theory of human nature. The soul then is identified by Heraclitus as the underlying unity of a human, and fire, or at least hotness and dryness, play a crucial role in the health of the soul. Heraclitus writes, "Dry light beam is soul at its wisest and best, and it is death to souls to become moist." So a good soul is dry and a bad soul is moist. This is also the part where we get one of my favorite quotes of philosophy. "When a man is drunk, he is led by a beardless boy, staggering, unaware of where he walks, having a moist soul." As we can see, Heraclitus explains the stupid behavior of drunk people by saying that their beverage has turned their soul moist. So the soul appears to control the intelligence of a person. A dry soul means a smart person, and a moist soul means a stupid one. Additionally, souls are also described as mortal and immortal. As a soul always dies, but it cannot stay dead. To be dead can only be a momentary phase at an extreme point of a cycle, after which it returns to life. As a soul is both mortal and immortal, there isn't much of a difference between the gods and humanity. It's suggested that for Heraclitus it is a matter of chance whether a soul manifests itself as a human or a god. We can see this inessential difference between humans and gods in the following fragments. Human character, or ethos, does not have understanding, but divine character does. And a man is called infant by a daimon, just as a child is by a man. Ethos here means something like habit, something that is characteristic of something but not essential. We may interpret the first fragment as saying that humans typically do not have understanding and that gods do, but that does not mean that humans cannot have understanding. The second fragment implies that a human can indeed grow up and achieve real understanding. Heraclitus is also quite optimistic about who can achieve this understanding, as he said, "All human beings share the capacity to know themselves and to be of sound mind." And I think that's a nice note to end on. Heraclitus today remains a fascinating philosopher with much to offer, and his idea of the unity and opposites inspired great philosophers like Hegel and Marx. If you wish to learn more about his ideas, I have put the books I used for this video in the description. Thank you for watching.